Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. This is Srini here, and this is my channel. You can just go ahead and subscribe in YouTube and do hit the bell to get notifications. So you'll be getting a lot of useful videos on different technologies and interview questions. So do stay tuned and do subscribe to my channel. So today we are going to look at the part two of our API automation series, and we are going to look at the basics of REST assured automation. We're also going to start looking into the installation of Postman tool, and we'll just have a small introduction of Postman in this session. Followed by in the next session, we will have a detailed look at how to do Postman testing, right? Using the APIs, whatever we have, how do we do API testing using Postman? That we will be looking in the next video. So let's get started, guys. Yeah, so this is the agenda for today. And there is a second slide as well after this one. So let's get started. So what is REST assured, right? So REST assured is basically like an architectural design or pattern, and it basically conforms to certain set of rules or constraints that we call it as REST constraints. So those APIs which are basically conforming to these REST constraints, right? Those we call it as REST assured APIs, right? So today it's becoming a popular REST. This is like a very popular API available in the market, as all of you might be already be aware of, right? It's given by Google and it's being used widely across so many different applications as well, be it Twitter, be it Facebook, be it Jira. There are so many different examples of APIs where these real life practical examples, Instagram, right? So these all examples are using REST assured APIs, and it's often that we come across this terminology and we don't know what exactly it's all about. So here we are going to look at everything from the scratch. We don't have to know anything or any background about it. So first thing when we are talking about REST assured API is that we need to know who are the two parties who are in contention, or who are the ones who are interacting with each other, right? So we are having one particular entity called as client and one entity called as server. Already we have seen in the last session a little overview on that. So in this particular session, we are going to go one step further, right? So a client is like one entity. So they would be requesting for some information from the server, right? And server would say, okay, let me check if I have that information available. And they will be returning back the information back to the client. But it isn't that simple as it sounds, right? If anyone just asks for the information and the server just returns the information, then there might be certain information which could be risk, or we could say, be compromised with respect to security. So we have to be careful about that, right? So let's understand the terminologies one by one. Here, the client is one party, other one is server, right? How are they going to interact with each other? So that is going to be through HTTP protocol, right? This is the transport exchange mechanism. So they are going to interact over HTTP protocol, right? And so client is going to basically send some information, asking for some information from the server. That information which the client wants is called as a resource. So that these are the different terminologies we are going to discuss first, actually. So we have already seen what is REST assured API. So before I go to REST constraints, right, I just wanted to give a brief introduction about what is REST assured, what are the different terminologies, etc. So I'm just explaining with an example here. So a client would basically request for some information from the server. That information we call it like a resource. So that resource will be basically represented with some unique locator. I mean, it will be having a unique path. To reach to a resource, you need to have a proper path, right? Once you have given that path, and if you are an authenticated user, so I'm using the word authenticated user, that means server would not just give the information to any user, right? It would just first authenticate whether the client or the user who is requesting the information is indeed an authenticated person who should be getting that response back from the server. That will be the first level of check which will be done. Now there are APIs where there is no authentication at all. It's just like free dummy APIs. There is no such sensitive or any important information available at the server side. So they are like, fine, we can give you this information because it's dummy in nature, right? So a RESTful web application is basically that application basically who would just expose their APIs to the client, such that if any particular resource has to be requested by the client, they will be able to get that provided they are an authenticated user. And even they would allow the client to take actions on those resources as well, like creating some data at the server side, modifying the information of the resource, whatever they have requested, right? So all such kind of actions can be, given by the RESTful APIs to the client, and that is how we would have the CRUD operations achieved. So when we say CRUD operations, we are talking about the create, read, update, and delete, which we had seen in the last lecture, right? So those CRUD operations would then be possible, that you will be able to create the information at the server side, we'll be able to retrieve or read the information. We also would be able to update the information as well as delete the information at the server side. Right. So I hope these concepts are clear. Right. So now let's look at the other terminologies, what is there, right? We have looked at what is resource, and we looked at, okay, there are different operations which a user could perform, like create, read, update, or delete, right? What is a base URL now? So base URL is that part of the URL from the exact resource, right? If you're talking about like reaching to a resource, there would be one particular URL which is like always going to be constant, right? It's the, let's say it's located in particular domain or a website. So that part of the website which is like always static, let's say www.regressin.com, there is one website, let's say like that, right? So this is the website or the host which is holding the resource, right? If you want to reach to the resource, there has to be a relative path. So as an example, let me just show you from a perspective like how we can just look at that, right? So let's look at this example, right? This is the host, or this is the first part of it, right? This is the base URL, and this is what we're talking about is the resource, right? So together, this host and this particular resource, they would make your URI, right? So URI stands for Uniform Resource Identifier, and the first portion what you've seen is called as the base URL, and the second part is called as the resource. So now let's look at the other key REST architectural elements as a part of REST, right? So we have seen what is URL, we have seen what is URI and resource, right? So again, let me just repeat this example, right? So this stands for base URL, right? Let me just copy it down here and let me just put it here. Right, so this is the base URL. Now to appending to that is going to be your resource, right? This is going to be your resource. So it doesn't allow me to copy, but let me just write it down. /API/users $page equal to 2. Right. So this is going to be your complete URL now, right? So if you look at this particular complete URL, the first part, the one in yellow color, which you can see, right? This portion, the first part is going to be your base URL. The one which you see after slash is going to be your relative path to reach to your resource, right? So together, when you add this base URL and resource path, it forms your URI. So this is going to be nothing but your URI. So URI stands for Uniform Resource Identifier. That is the full form of URI. Now, apart from these three conceptual terms, we also have other conceptual things which we need to understand, right? We have something called resource ID. So here, every resource is going to have an identification of how you're going to identify. Like example here, we are trying to get the list of users, but how? We are going to get it through this parameter or filter given. The filter given here or the condition given here is that page equal to 2. So this is basically called as query parameter. You're giving a question mark and you're giving what particular value you want. So this is going to be your resource identifier, that is page is equal to 2. You want to get this kind of a resource from the server, right? And as we discussed, there needs to be some kind of authentication when a server is giving some information back to the client. The client has to be authenticated. But in this scenario, this particular API is a dummy API, right? So it doesn't require any kind of authentication as such from this client. So it will give the information back, and the response code you can see is 200, right? And it has given the information back in some kind of a format, right? So this is what we call it as the response payload. This is the response payload. And there is no request payload here. There is no payload being sent by the client to the server because it was simply a get operation, right? We just did a get list of users and giving this kind of a parameter where page is equal to 2, and it has given us back the response. So the way the information is exchanged between the two, right, that is nothing but called as representation, right? So when we are sending the request to the client, let's say if we had some other kind of a request like a post request, right? If you look at this representation, it is in the form of JSON. It is having a key and a value pair. So this is called as representation type, right? It's called as a representation of the request. But here the representation is happening in the form of JSON. Similarly, the response which is obtained from the server is also in the form of JSON, right? Now, along with the representation here, there is some other extra information which the client may have to send to the server, right, in the request. That is, what is the type of request it is sending. So here it is in the form of JSON, right? So it is going to send the type of the request you're going to send here is in the form of JSON. Sometimes it could also be in XML format. So this is the different ways we can exchange the information between client and a server. It could be XML, JSON, HTML. And so the same way client response received from the server is given back to the client, and that is also in the form of JSON. And it is having some other extra attributes which the client may be making use of. Now let's look at the REST constraints here. These constraints are going to allow any API to be made or called as a REST API only based on these constraints, right? So let's look at the first one. The first one is called as uniform interface. So uniform interface actually has got 4 parts to it, right? So let's look at those 4 parts for this particular first REST constraint, right? So the first part says that whatever request the client is being sending to the server, right, that should have the resource ID. The resource ID should be present so that the resource could be located by the server and could be, given back the information back to the client. That's the first part of the uniform interface, right? The second part states that, okay, whatever information client is sending, they should be sending all the useful or all the complete information along with the resource, like other supportive information like headers and other information which the server would be able to understand what exact resource has been requested, right? Similarly, when the server sends back the resource back to the client, they should be giving the information in such a way that it is understandable by the client that, okay, I have got the resource, right? The third important part is that the server should be able to give the information such a way to the client that they should be able to even modify it. So this may sound a bit tricky, but what it tries to say is that server is trying to give back some information to the client, right? But they should also be able to modify the resource. So that kind of information also should be given back to the client. And the fourth part is called as hypermedia as the engine of application state. So again, I'll repeat, hypermedia as the engine of application state. So this means that server is giving back some information to the client in the form of some hyperlink or some link, right? So those links would be having the information of the different ways with which client can modify the resource. So that is called as hypermedia as a state of application engine, right? Engine of application state. So this is going to be the main engine, hypermedia, for the application state to be determined. And it will also give the ways how we can modify the resource from the client side. So that all information will be given back by the server in the response when it sends back to the client, right? Let's come to the second REST constraint, that is called client server separation. So as we have discussed before, client and server are the two entities here, and they are completely separated from each other. Client's role is to send the request to the server in the form of certain representation, right? It could be XML, it could be JSON, and also give a proper URL so that server is able to locate that resource and give it back to the client. This is the main architecture going on here. The transport is happening through HTTP transfer protocol, right? The information is getting exchanged, and we have the metadata information like what is the application type, whether it is in XML format or JSON format, similarly from the server side. So until server doesn't hear back from the client or it doesn't get the request from this client, server is not going to do anything, right? It's just going to sit idle. So only when the client requests for some information, and if that information is present at the server side, it will give back the response back to the client. If the resource is found, it will give back the response with the respective status code like 200 or 201. If the resource is not found at the server side for some reason, it is going to give some particular error like 404 page not found. If the resource ID being requested is not available at the server side, it may have got deleted, it may have been obsolete, not available at the server side. So based on that, the server is going to give back the information to the client, right? The third REST constraint is called as stateless. So when we say stateless means what? That means from a server perspective, it's talking about that whatever previous calls it has got, maybe by the same client, it is not going to remember any information at all. It says you may have requested me earlier with some resource, a get call or a post call or a put call. I don't have to remember what you have requested me or the history, whatever you have requested me earlier, right? It's not going to remember any of them. That's the reason it's called as stateless. It's not going to remember any of them. It's just going to treat every request as a separate fresh call and just going to service that part. That is why it is called as stateless. Any API which is conforming to REST constraint should be stateless, right? The fourth one is called as layered system. So to give an example and explain this concept, right? Let's say that a client is going to request some information from the server, and in between there might be so many different servers which would be serving as an intermediate interface kind of a role, right? So client doesn't know there might be so many such interfaces or application servers in between before it reaches the actual main server. So that is the concept behind layer system, right? The client is basically not knowing anything at all. It's like completely not knowing anything what's going on between intermediate layers, right? And how the information is reaching to the server. Similarly, once the information comes from the server, through what all layers does it have to pass through to come to the client? They would not have any information. And that is the idea about this layered system, right? Client doesn't need to know anything about the different layers before anything is being exchanged with the server. The next constraint is called as cacheable. So as we can understand with the name, right, itself, cacheable means it's all about talking about this word called cache, right? It's talking about this cache. So cache, if people, whoever are not knowing about this, right? Cache is a terminology being used when, like, if you want to request a particular resource from a server, right? You would be requesting a call. Let's say you get the response back and you are, able to view it. Sometimes a client may feel that this particular resource I may need to again request in future. So rather than again requesting a call and again getting the response back to the client, it will lead to some wastage of time, right? So rather than that from getting happen, what the client does is that they store some useful information in the form of cache. So cache means that kind of a useful information which the client stores with them, which they may be requesting in future. So they think that why should we again request for the same information when we can have it locally available with us? Since it's going to be a vital information, let's store some information in a kind of a fast kind of a repository where we can retrieve it anytime. So that they call it as cache, right? So server basically sends the information. When it sends the resource information back to the client, it also gives some other metadata information that also has a idea or attributes about whether it can be cacheable or not. If yes, it is cacheable, then what is the version of it? So client can basically look in future, what is the version of information they are having for that resource. If they feel that's the updated one, they need not request it again to the server. They can simply retrieve it from that particular cache rather than resourcing, rather than asking again for the server for the new information, right? So that's all what we call about cacheable, right? That's another attribute what we have for a REST constraint. The last one is code on demand. Okay, this is going to be basically an optional one. So I'm going to mention it as optional in bracket. It's not a mandate from a REST constraint perspective, but it's an optional one. So what this means is that client can sometimes ask for the code from the server, right? So they may need to maybe interact with the server and get the code, and server would then send back the response with the actual code or the script, and client may be using that information to their usage, right? So that's the feature about code on demand. So if client wants it, they will be requesting for the code from the server, and server will again reply back with the response with the code, right? So these are the three main topics we have seen in this particular slide deck. I hope you have got the concept completely from a REST assured API perspective. Let's move on to the next slide. So the next one is about the different HTTP methods, right? So we have get, post, delete, put, patch, to name a few, which are the important HTTP methods we are going to use whenever we have client and server interaction, right? So as the name suggests here, get means what? We are basically requesting for a resource from the server, right? And so we are basically going to just get the information. We're not going to create any resource or any information at the server side. We're just going to get the information. That is why it's called as a get call. The next one is called post. So as the name suggests, posting something at the server, right? So we are going to create a resource. We are going to create a particular information saved at the server side. So it's called as post. Delete means we are going to delete a resource from the server. Put means what it's going to do is that it's just going to update the information which is existing at the server side. That's the resource part. If it is not present for some reason, it's going to create the resource. So it's going to act like post if it is not already existing at the server side. Patch is basically like partially updating or modifying the information. That's why we call it like a patch, right? So we are going to use these 5 services mainly when we look at the API examples, right? So that was all about rest assured API basics, what you needed to know. And now we are ready to go ahead and understand the next concept, which is the Postman tool, right? So we have a tool available in the market, not just Postman tool. There are a lot of tools available in the market like REST client and Postman tool. These all tools basically help to interact with the API. So they will be hitting the API, and through that, what would happen is that we are going to get the response from the API, and that will be basically passed to the client. That is the client here. In let's take an example, right? So let's say we are going to take an example of a Twitter API. If we would want to basically interact with the Twitter APIs, so there will be Twitter APIs which are going to be available. So let's say through Postman tool, we try to hit the Twitter API, right? So what would happen here, right? So we are going to have the Twitter API get the information from the our script. We will be having let's say a kind of automation script. So automation script is going to interact with the Twitter API. It is going to get the request as to what exactly it has to do. Let's say we are talking about posting some tweet on Twitter, right? Our own timeline. So what we're going to do, we are going to ask our API to interact with the API, just post a status message, and that Twitter API is going to interact with the actual UI that is in the Twitter UI, and it is going to post that tweet. So here, who is the client, right? So client here is going to be the UI, right? So through the usage of the API, we are able to successfully post a tweet on a Twitter account, right? So that's all we are going to have. An API play a role of, like an intermediate person. It will just take care as if we are doing that operation on the UI. It will just do the similar action. So we are going to see that in detail when we'll start looking at our API examples. So now let's have a look as to how the Postman tool is, how to install it. And we're going to just see a small introduction of Postman in this video. And as you can see here in the next video, we're going to have a detailed look at how to use the different features of Postman and how to do a manual API testing, right? And then we will follow it up with our API automation testing. So let's get started. So let's go and try to download the Postman app. So this, you have to go to this website, getpostman.com. And depending upon the operating system which you are using, be it Mac, Linux, or Windows, just go ahead and download it, right? So for Windows, you can download depending upon the bit size, 64 or 32. So once you click on the download, it will start downloading, and you just have to install it. I already have it installed. You just have to follow the steps what it is basically suggesting you. Just keep on following next, and then finally install it. So once you have installed it and you have got a shortcut icon at your desktop, just open it up, and you will be asked to first sign it up. So let me first close it. So I have already got it open. So let me close it. You will be getting just kind of a Postman API like this one. Just double click on it. So it will first ask you to sign up. So you just have to sign up with your Gmail account, and once you're done, you can next time use it to sign in, and you can start playing with the different APIs. So since I've already signed in, it is showing me the home page. But once you have registered and you have signed in, you will be able to see this kind of a screen when you're doing it for the first time. You will be able to see these kind of different options, right? So I'm not going to go too much in detail since we are going to have a separate dedicated session for Postman. I'll just show you how the endpoint URL looks like, etc. So for now, just don't worry anything about it. Let's just first click on this, create a basic request. Let me click on this, right? So it is asking for a request name. Let's say get regress API call, right? And let's do one thing. So let's just select a collection or the folder to save it to. So we'll have to just go ahead and create a collection here. So let me say API practice. Right. right? So we're going to create this API practice called collection, and let's just drag down. And here you can see there is an option to create the collection. So let's click on this button. So there we go. So we have created this API practice particular collection, and we just are going to save a request to that. Let's save it. So this is the get regress API call, right? So I've got a simple collection created now. So this is how it's going to look like. So I'll just show you. Just go to this collections tab, and here we see there is an API practice tab. If you click on that, you can see this get regress API call, right? So here we are. Here we would be having the different options. What all different options of API we have, the different methods we are having of HTTP, right? To have the resource requested from the server. We have get, we have post, put, patch, delete. These are the 5 which we discussed about, right? Now there are others also which are not that frequently used, but these are the 5 we are going to focus mainly on, right? So let's take an example. So there is another website here, which is like a dummy website for you to practice APIs, which is called https regress.in. So let me copy this URL and let me place it here. So this is what we call it as the base URL. Now here you see there is different options for different calls, for get, for post, see for put, patch, delete. There are different options you are having. You can use any of them for your practice part, and it's completely not requiring any authentication at all. So it's free to use. So go ahead and make use of it and do practice. So let's go ahead and click on this list of users, right? So if we pass this particular endpoint URL, this is the resource information, right? This is the URL or the resource location part. So that part we have to embed here, but it is leading to 2/. So we just have to backspace 1, and this is going to be now your complete URI, uniform resource identifier. So for get call as such, we don't have to pass any specific information here because we don't have any body. So for get call, there will not be any body. There will be just the URL you're going to pass, and you're retrieving the information from the server side, right? If you pass the information in such a way, you are having a question mark and then page equal to 2. This suggests that it's called as a query parameter. So page equal to 2 is a query parameter suggesting the server that we have to get the list of users which is belonging to the page 2. So let's first save it so that we can just save it to our collection, and it's in sync now. See, this got rotated. It's in sync. Just click on send. So here we go. We have got the response successfully, and the status is 200 OK. And this is how the response payload looks like. It has randomly given us some information of the dummy data available at the server side with some IDs available. So these are the IDs of the different users along with their attributes like ID, email, first name, last name, and the avatar. So there are a lot of users available here on the page number 2, right? So that's all for this particular lecture. I hope you have, learned a lot from this tutorial session. The next one would be too much informative, mostly on the Postman tool as well. So do share with your friends and do subscribe to my channel if you haven't done it. Thank you so much.